I think it's that time. For what? Another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. Welcome back. It's your host, Gautam Yegapin, alive and blessed to present you with today's conversation. Stay thirsty for knowledge, and I guess some water too. Season 12 has been going amazingly. I am so excited for today's conversation. We're speaking to Sharon Ravitch. She is a professor of practice at the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education and is a global leader in adaptive leadership, participatory research, and coalition-based systems change. Her work integrates education, anthropology, leadership, international development, and indigenous knowledge systems to address pressing global challenges, particularly those related to sustainability, equity, and organizational transformation. Through her partnerships with indigenous leaders and global organizations, her positions knowledge, integration, equity, and cultural humility as central to all educational and developmental work. How are you doing today?
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. I'm doing great and I'm excited to be
No,
here with you.
no, I was really looking forward to today's conversation. And I just feel like it's so nice. I think my personal experience working with a lot of academics is sometimes it's rare to come across people who have a lot of energy and just like a
Yeah,
sense of,
yeah.
but it's not just energy. What it is really is a sense of self, where I feel like I
Mm,
think sometimes the identities that we are asked to take can be so restrictive that we like feel like we need to present in a certain way. So
I
sometimes
agree.
I feel like I'm talking to robots, even though the ideas are
Mm,
fascinating. I'm like, there
yeah,
has to
I know
be a
what you
human
mean.
somewhere, you know? How do you
Yeah,
feel like,
yeah.
just from the brief few minutes of interaction, how do you feel like you've been able to sustain a sense of like excitement and self while still navigating academia at the highest level?
Well, that is a great question. So first, I'll just say thank you so much for inviting me. As you mentioned, I'm faculty at Penn at the Graduate School of Education, and I really, my love of my life is leaders and leaders, teams, and organizations. And I'm very interested in how they make sense of complexity, how they surface invisible logics holding them back, and how they build cultures where they and other people around them can think, speak, and grow in productive and catalytic ways, individually and together. And so your question actually is related to that. How does one keep a sense of authenticity and curiosity when the performance that the workplace often demands is at times prioritizing other kinds of things? And I'll answer this personally, and then I'll pull it back a little bit and talk about this at the workscape level. And so, for me personally, I think it's that I honestly feel so lucky to be doing what I'm doing. I feel I'm the first woman. My sister and I are the first women in my family to go to college. And there's a way that from the moment I got to college until today, I have felt enormously grateful to have far surpassed what I didn't even think I would go to college, actually. And so I have so far surpassed what I thought professionally and then also, in some ways personally. And so I think for me, it's about the reverence that I have for learning and honestly for people. It's like that Desiderata poem that I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it basically the punchline is we're all children of the universe, worthy of good, simply because we exist. And I think for me, the excitement about my work is an excitement about the fact that I get to be in orbit with other human beings, figuring out the human condition every day. And to me, I'm the luckiest person. I get to work with brilliant students every day who really care about the world and colleagues. So I think for me that's the balance. Even though academia is not always a space that is the most affirming or even humanizing, I do think that it's the relationships that we build, not just with other people, but actually with ourselves, that can help us resist some of the pulls of whether it's grind culture or hyper individualist mindsets or whatever it is. I think a true love of humanity fosters a curiosity. And I think for me, that's translated into trying to navigate really elite spaces by using my body as a bridge for other people to opportunities that they deserve.
Hmm. And I mean, the magic that kind of happens, I think, in a lot of professional spaces, and honestly, I think I would even expand to say that I think people's professional lives have expanded to take up so much of just their day to day, where
That's right.
it's not really a 9 to 5. I mean, you start thinking
No,
about work at 7, you
that's
start
right.
preparing, you work for a couple hours after. I mean, it really is, I would say, more than 75 or 80% of what you do and who you become. And so the kind of professional limitations then carry over to how you navigate friendships. I mean, everything. And
That's
so
exactly right. That's
so
exactly right.
I think this idea of authenticity is really interesting because it's really complex to kind of pin down what authentic means
That
because
is correct.
I was talking to a friend recently and she's a model and she said something really interesting to me that really kind of struck something in my mind where she was saying that sometimes what authentic can be is simply just a response to what is like quote unquote normal or expected. So if being reserved and quiet about political issues, then being authentic can just be being perceived as if you care about these things. But that may not necessarily be who you truly are. It just
Right.
means you're still acting just in a way that's slightly aligned differently. So when we talk
That's
about
right. That's
authenticity,
interesting.
what
Yeah.
do we feel like that really means? How do we identify whether I'm truly being authentic?
Well, that's a really interesting question. And I think, because one question is, are we even connected to ourselves to know what authentic means? And I think for me, I'm 54 and I've done a lot of work on myself, my consciousness, and really trying to be as present as I can. And I think part of that is about, at least in the work that I've done, it's about thinking about why we are how we are. How did I get here? How do I have the beliefs that I have? How have I been conditioned to think about good and bad choices for myself? Grind culture is a good example. Or any kinds of things that Don Miguel Ruiz in the Four Agreements, which is one of my absolute bedrock books, I think is important. I was introduced to it through a therapist of mine, actually, and I assign it in my classes because part of what Ruiz is saying is when we're young, we're conditioned into a set of agreements about the way the world works by the adults around us. That's not a criticism. That's just the way human development happens when we're small. Those are parents, coaches, grandparents, whomever is around us, and our teachers. Those people, they have priorities and values and epistemologies and ostensibly agreements. And as young kids, we're, soaking those up like sponges. And by the time we're old enough to think about them, we've been habituated to our own agreements. And so I think from a Ruizian perspective, which is one that I try to live, um, being authentic is figuring out what agreements did I make that I actually agree
Mm,
with, what life choices, what logics, what frames for my life and the world and understanding people, and what priorities, have I logged into unconsciously? I was younger, but now how do I create the conditions to be able to explicate those to myself, to be able to see sedimented invisible agreements and logics, and how in their invisibility I'm making choices that seem like they're free will, but for if I only had the time to actually really spend some time with myself and see, do I agree with these agreements? I would say that I do. But that's why, people used to talk about this thing called a midlife crisis. Also, by the way, a logic of how to frame that, because I would argue it's a midlife awakening. And that it doesn't always happen at midlife anyway. But what is that? I think a lot of times, if we think about this through the framework of being conditioned into a set of agreements and logics before we know if we actually agree with them, but then they become us, right? We're sort of tamed and conditioned through them. From my perspective, until we have an interruptive experience that helps us see we've even made agreements, how are we going to know if we're authentic? Because are we authentic to our true sense of self, or are we being authentic to a constructed, in a US context, often sort of Judeo Christian morality framework that circumscribes what makes us good or bad or selfish or worthy. And to me, being able to decide if I'm authentic, I had to do that first work first to actually go a layer deeper into myself. Grind culture is a perfect example. I really had to work hard to extract myself from it. It was an invisible logic. I got my self-worth out of working hard and then you start to see it objectively. And that's where the seed of freedom is born. And to me, that seed of freedom is the seed of authenticity. The seed to say, you know what, I give myself permission to go against the grain because now that I've done some reflection, I realize the grain is not authentic to me. So I think authenticity for me comes out of a deeply reflexive engagement with self and conditioning through a kind of solutionary framing of like, how did I get here? And what can I see in how I got here that I could have some movement in to whatever, be happier, feel freer, have a better sense of agency, whatever, whatever it is somebody's thinking about this for.
Yeah. I mean, before connecting this to leadership, I think one interesting piece of this has been we've been reading this book called The Dispossessed by Ursula Guin. You've read it?
Well, no, I love Ursula Le Guin, though. I
Okay,
have not
yeah.
read The Dispossessed, but I do think her work is incredible.
Yeah, she's amazing. And
Yeah,
I feel like in a lot of ways, sometimes it feels like there are these words, whether it's equity or even authenticity,
yeah,
without really critiquing, we just set as like a positive
I
thing to
agree.
be aimed for,
I agree.
without really like questioning what are the values. Because I think while there are a lot of values that seem to come out of authenticity, there's also a lot that you lose in that process. And
That's exactly right.
right. And
That's
so
exactly right.
so when we think about authenticity, especially in context of leadership or just in general, how do we kind of how do you, I guess, navigate that tension of like, what are my real values that I care about? And then to what extent does authenticity play towards those rather than just having authenticity be like the end goal?
Such an interesting question. So, what are my values and priorities, and how does authenticity help? I'm just making sure
Yeah.
I'm tracking. And how
Yeah,
does
yeah.
authenticity help me
Achieve
achieve?
those, I guess.
That's interesting. I don't know that I would make that relationship of. I think what I would say is I don't think authenticity. This is not answering your question. I actually know that, but I don't think that authenticity is a goal. I think authenticity is a state. And I
Yeah.
think that, so wait, I'm going back to your question now. So the question of if you're using authenticity in the actualization of goals, is that right? Well, I would
Yeah.
argue that's actually interesting, right? Because there's a world in which we could say,
Authenticity is the end.
yeah, authenticity is the end. Exactly. Um, it's really, you're complicating something in a very interesting way, because it's like authenticity maybe is also a process. I don't know, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
What I hear from a lot of people is it's taken them a lot of decades to feel that they can take up space in a variety of ways of what that means. And it means different things to different people for different reasons. Is authenticity the ability to take up space? I don't know. Is authenticity the decision of whether you want, even if you're allowed to take up that space, to take it up, or how to, or I mean, it's just interesting. Is authenticity an intrapsychic thing, or is it a performance? I think it's probably both. Like, are we even authentic to self? Is a really interesting thing.
Hmm. Right?
Um, I think for years I was not authentic to self, to be honest with you. I think that, I mean, I wouldn't have known that. It wasn't like my plan, but I couldn't handle the truths about, or didn't think, or whatever, that I could handle some truths about myself. And so I would pretend, for example, I didn't do bad things, or I never lied, or whatever, right? Because seeing my authentic self would have been too uncomfortable. And I hadn't done the healing yet enough to know that I'm actually I'm happy feeling uncomfortable. It's fine. As long
Mm.
as I'm conscious about it, that I'm uncomfortable, it's okay. So yeah, it's a really interesting question. I'm not sure how to answer you actually. I
No, I
guess
mean
I
it's a
would
it's a
say it helps you achieve any goal to be your most authentic self because then you're embodied. Except, we could argue like I authenticity has gotten me in trouble.
it can it
People
many
are like,
times, right?
you're violating the politeness contract, the social contract of politeness. And, if that's their priority, and my priority is brave spaces, honesty, or whatever, that's a competing values framework issue, right? Of sort of then what does that mean? And hierarchy and power, sort of how does that translate into choices I might make to be inauthentic in the service of myself, right? Like, I mean, it's a very complicated question. I love it. Um, I love it.
I think the reason it matters in relation to leadership and education, I mean, this has just been happening, showing up a lot in the conversations that we've been having because values are a really interesting thing because
Very.
there's a quote. I wish I should have this memorized. I've always had a hard time memorizing quotes, but it's this idea that when the value becomes the thing that you end up measuring or testing, all of a sudden, then it kind of loses this sense
That's
of
so.
the
I
value
know.
that
I
you
know
have.
the quote you're talking about, and I agree with it. I forget it
Right.
who said it
And
as
I,
well,
I
but
I
yeah,
think in that same sense, when you in schools, if you, let's say, for example, what you're trying to cultivate is a true curiosity for the world. And then you're
right.
like, okay, how do we then measure this? And then let's say you come up with like a few ways to kind of figure out a way to put a box around it. Then if people start then just playing based on that game and they're like, oh, okay, to show you that I'm learning, I have to simply just do this. You've now completely corrupted the original value that existed. And I think this plays so often in leadership settings where you
I
could
agree.
have, like, let's say you have a performance bonus. Let's say hypothetically that was just a tiny little carrot, but the real process of that is to develop a true care for whatever it is. But if people just get driven by the carrot, then you've never actually
Yeah.
expressed the growth of that value. So what are your thoughts on, I mean, this is kind of a big question, but I'm just curious though, but what are your thoughts in different leadership styles to approach these two very different kind of, I guess, outcomes?
And the outcomes being, I just want to make sure I'm tracking to approach the outcomes of.
Like, yeah, outcome wasn't, I didn't know what word to put there, but the vibe, I guess, of the question I'm asking is like, let's say you care about teamwork, right? Like I think in a few engineering companies they do this, but the way I can actually measure your teamwork, let's say, is how many comments you write on someone else's code. And if I simply only start tracking that, then I don't actually develop teamwork. I just develop people
Yeah, they're
playing
proxy
according to the
metrics is
game.
what I think of them as. Yeah, proxy metrics. They're not really measuring the thing you need to be measuring. You're bean counting.
So, what do you do from a leader perspective or organizational structure perspective to kind of handle this? Because it's a tension that it can never be fully solved, but you can.
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I'm hearing that if I'm understanding as a measurement and evaluation question in part, right? Which is, how do you measure, like how would you measure something like authenticity? How would you measure
True
um
values, yeah.
true values? And what ends up happening a lot is proxy metrics, where you're asking sort of questions around the circumference, but not really in the actual issue. And so, the way I think about that is we need contextualized metrics within organizations and systems. That's why we have qualitative and mixed methods data, because we need the contextualized, the textured, the nuanced, the layered accounts to really be able to understand what things look like from a range of nested perspectives in any ecosystem. So to me, if we wanted to measure something, we really need to think about how it sits in the ecosystem, who touches it, and then getting a range of perspectives. And to me, that's not a quantitative survey alone. It could include that, but it would necessarily need to include contextualized data, which is qualitative data, workplace data. And, this is, part of my work remit is to really think with organizational and systems leaders about how they can speak back to whether it's top-down metrics or external metrics or metrics from other countries or other analogous kinds of situations. For me, you don't measure what you only measure things that you value, and you have to measure things holistically, again, in terms of the range of nested perspectives on the issue. And this really framework comes from like an adaptive leadership, adaptive systems framework that says, for adaptive challenges, which are challenges that require more than technical solutions, that's a technical challenge. An adaptive challenge really requires strategically choosing representation from people closest to the phenomenon and engaging them in sense making and then meaning making processes that really help them to understand the issue at hand or the program at hand or the change initiative at hand as it is understood through a range of perspectives, right? And so
Mm,
to me, that is the hallmark of why we need qualitative and mixed methods data in the workplace. Leaders cannot use decontextualized metrics. They're not that helpful. They can't use nationally or internationally normed things unless they test them in situ in context. We have organizations and systems using metrics from other countries because they don't have homegrown metrics. So to my mind, the ability to in-house generate data meaningful to the issue at hand is the approach. We need the just in time data collection as well as the ongoing data collection. And to me, that's contextualized data that is really
mm.
strategic on sampling of the who needs to be involved in this. It's not necessarily the traditional players at the top, right? I think it's often that we actually need to figure out all the hands that are on this particular deck and learn from the cross section of their opinions, especially when there is disagreement among them, because they are situated very differently in relation to the phenomenon.
Interesting. Okay, so I mean, okay, so this is what I've been thinking about a lot in my own. I've had different kind of spaces to be a leader in, and so I've been trying to develop my own kind of thesis on some of these things, and I feel like one thing that's just been coming up again and again and again in this particular season is because when I hear the contrast between academics talking about education versus practitioners and practitioners across different levels, I'm realizing we're not all talking about the same thing. When a
No,
teacher
we are
talks about
not.
education, they're talking about education very differently than when a superintendent is talking about
That's
it, right?
exactly right.
Or because it's like the scales themselves are just so vastly different.
That's
What you're
right.
interacting with, what you think education is, what you think the value is completely different. So we're not all talking about the same thing. So with that, keeping that in mind, I feel like when we think about a structure, it's very different when we're talking about it at like 100 person scale, 1,000 person scale, 10,000. So are there some like ideas around this of like different at what point does an organization go from level A to level B? And is that based on size or is it based on connectivity? Like how do you and then yeah, are there different kind of groupings of sizes of organizations?
And you mean that in terms of like what? Like,
So for just one example, like I run a book club, for example, and
okay, yeah.
the kind of ideas and like the ways of leadership that are effective for 4 people in just my experience is very different than when it's 10 people. And I'm
Oh,
assuming
okay,
it's very
okay. I
different than
got you.
100
So
people.
like scaling.
Yeah, are there particular like terminology that we use to call different stages of organizations based on the size? Because I think you have to nav function them very differently.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So are there different approaches based on like size and scope and remit? And the answer to that is definitely.
Yeah.
In adaptive leadership, context is everything. And so, yes, actually, is it a multinational, you know, 5 different headquarters? Is it one headquarters and 6 country offices? Is it a global company? Is it, a 20 person, the scale really matters because in terms of thinking about, let's say, learning in systems, size and scope matters. And so, are there things that get shared across all organizations? Yes. Are there things that, depending on the size of your organization, might be new or different or more complex? Yes. And so, to me, like in my consulting and my advising and coaching work, I can be talking to a CEO of a 30-person company, and I can be talking of a CEO of a global 500,000 person company. And a lot of times we're talking about the same things, but the solutions are different. The processes are
Mm,
different. Sometimes they're similar, but you have to design for scale. And so, to me, really from the smallest organization around the corner to the largest organization in the world, they're sharing a lot of the same issues. How we
mm,
engage is about both the hard infrastructure, the actual size and scale, and how one needs to plan for that. Right. So you need a lot more resources for professional development in the larger one, right? Potentially, not necessarily, but because AI is now sort of changing that. But I think that some of it is about size, because as we know from leadership now, purpose and teamwork and things like this, they are affected by the complexity of the hard infrastructure of the place. But then it's the soft infrastructure that's going to be, it's how those two come together. So when you're helping people try to become like a more adaptive organization, for example, more adaptive leader, more adaptive organization, have more adaptive teams, if they're bigger or smaller, you're really thinking in terms of how to scale. And what you mentioned earlier with your book group, yeah, like when you have a 4-person book group that then becomes a 50-person book group, what I think of that as is an issue of customized replication. And I'll define that. I've defined it in some of my work, but customized replication is a scaling kind of a thing. I want to replicate my book group because it's amazing. And when I replicate it and scale it up, how do I make sure I don't lose the reason it was amazing? Which part of that was the intimacy. Part of that was the relationships. Part of that was it was only 4 people. So then you scale something up, and and my work in Nicaragua, we started on one school with this participatory action research school reform, and we slowly scaled it up to 16 schools. Then we scaled it up to a national level. But the thing that the thing that vexed us the entire time was, how do we scale this up without losing why it's magical, without losing
mm.
how it worked so well, because of all the excitement of a new project and all of the attention and all of, and so, yeah, it worked great. Now we want to replicate it, scale it up, even if we're doing that slowly, which we did to learn lessons. What we still realized very much so is, again, context is everything. And so to me, it's the customized replication is, how do we understand any new, if you're adding people into a group, if you're adding an organization or content, how do you think about that? Or if you're replicating, how do you think about what were the success factors that were amorphous, that were relational, that were more esoteric? And how do you try to bring them in and solidify and formalize them without flattening them and reducing what made them the pulsating, successful impetus they were? And a lot of times you see that ends up being people and relationships. And so if you're replicating something and it was the very people doing it and how they related with each other that made it, then how are you trying to move that forward? And so we've tried to solve for
Wow.
that,
Yeah.
but it's an intense part of really thinking about, how do
Super.
you scale positive things? How do you scale anything and not lose, again, you use the word, like the magic that it had when it was smaller?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's amazing. I mean, this whole
It's
thing, I mean,
amazing, right?
it's
It's like, this is
amazing.
why
I
I
mean,
love my job. It's fascinating.
no,
This is fascinating.
I think when I first approached this whole exploration into education, I was originally really fascinated by the kind of philosophical implications, our relationship to epistemology.
Yeah,
So, what is knowledge?
absolutely.
Why? And then I became
Absolutely.
really fascinated by an actual classroom, by the pedagogy of like what
Yeah.
is good teaching, the neuroscience of what does it mean to learn. But as I've been like understanding, so many of the challenges that come from education are not because we you can't even necessarily pinpoint it to being that we have faulty philosophical understanding around education or that we have faulty pedagogy. It sometimes can simply just be what we're talking about here, which is the scale at which we conduct
That's right.
education is
Yeah.
so massive. I mean,
I absolutely agree with you.
it's
I
insane.
absolutely agree with
It's
you. So, and then we're wondering why things are suffering. You know what I mean? It's like
it's hard. I
also
mean, it's
tax-based funding for schools, but we can talk about that on a different podcast.
yeah.
But, I think that that's not good. But I think that
No, no, it's okay.
you know, yeah, I mean, this is how do you reproduce something amazing that was unique?
And that is so relational. It's not
And
like
that is
it
so relational and
and
so
context oriented.
contextual.
So
Exactly.
contextual. Like
Exactly.
it can't
That's my
be it
work in the
can't.
world is literally this. How do we replicate things that are working in ways that do justice, not just to and with the people on the ground, but to what we learn by practicing this, by trying this, by, iterating this in participatory ways with the community so that, they're not just a part of it, they're driving it with us, and I think to me, a lot of education really does require that now that, this top down stuff it usually doesn't work. And so, my career has gravitated to participatory methodologies precisely because they foreground the epistemology that everyone is an expert of their own experience and that is what's required to put forward collective efforts at change. And
Can I ask you a
so,
qu
yeah, of course.
sorry.
Yeah, yeah, no,
I'm
you're great.
so curious
No,
about
we're
this one
vibing.
question.
You can keep
Okay.
going. You're good.
Okay, because I've always thought about this, and let me maybe just start my idea out with this. I feel like when I think about what is good work or what is it that makes us feel so excited to be alive, to really wake up and feel like, I feel like a thing that I've heard from a lot of people is seeing the outcome of the work that you've put in, right? Like not being kind, because when things get so abstract, you might be working on such a small piece of something, you don't ever get to see the real impact of what it is that you do. So I feel like really seeing either the physical manifestation or the digital manifestation of what you've done and having a iteration loop where you feel rewarded, you feel affirmed, and then you also feel a sense of autonomy. But the larger and larger these organizations get, you just can't, it can't function if everyone feels that way. You
Yeah,
have to
that's
be
right.
super niche. And I think, I guess one of my questions is, do you feel like maybe, is there a capacity past which maybe humans weren't meant to like, we were maybe just always meant to be in groups of maybe at max 10,000 people, 100, like maybe our brains can't figure out how to be like, oh, here's 400 million people, figure it out. Like,
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. To me, the bigger question is, what do we do with it?
hmm,
What do we do with it? Whether we were made for it or not, it is our human condition. And so the question becomes, you know, between human and artificial intelligence, how can we figure out this moment and meet this moment? And to me, that's a really big piece of this. Um, we have the problem sets we have now. And when I hear people, and I understand, and sometimes it's me, I'm hearing, complaining about the state of the world, there's a lot to complain about. I tend to be much more solutionary in my orientation. And so to me, it's actually maybe we were made to be in these big groups and maybe we weren't, but we are. And so the question becomes, how do we come together in our full humanity and create the conditions for collective liberation? And,
hmm.
I'm the next person to say, I mean, people have been saying this, most of the people that you and I look up to, I'm sure, have been saying this, right? That we have to come together, you know, um, as a set, right? Or like what Ramana Maharshi says, when he was asked the question, and how do we treat others? And his answer was, there are no others. And I think, to me, that's where we need to go, is there are no others. And so the logics that we currently have, I call them invisible logics, but the logics that we currently have as a human race are outdated. And we need to literally update the operating system of our logics. So there's a few pieces to that, right? One piece of that is what I say, and actually I just co-edited a book with a dear colleague, Dr. Raghu Krishnamurti, and a bunch of our former doctoral students in the Chief Learning Officer program at Penn. They all wrote chapters, and these are leaders in their full stride in the corporate space, writing about all different sorts of challenges that they faced and taking inquiry to it. And we started the book with the line, the era of precedent is over. And I truly believe in my deepest heart, and I am a futurist. I mean, it's not the way I really announce myself in the world, but it's how I think. I truly do believe that really the logic, precedent is a logic. We think we can make decisions based on precedent. That's a logic.
Mm,
That's not
mm.
real. Maybe it was never real, but now that precedent is out the window, it's surely unreal. And so to me, part of where we've arrived now as a human race is we have an unprecedented problem set, and precedent is not going to help us. And so we need to create new blueprints in and of ourselves and with each other that can help us to adapt into the moment. I truly believe that the logics we're walking around with right now are the wrong logics for right now. They are older logics that need updating, and many of them are fear-based, scarcity mindset-based, deficit-based, either towards others and or self. And these kinds of sedimented, conditioned logics are part of the problem of humanity right now. And I really, from my mind, if we can really together start to think about those logics that they're invisible to us right now, right? Like, here's one I'll share. Here's a logic you hear a lot with stuff that's going on, for example, with immigration and ICE. And, what I hear at times in these conversations is people whose families immigrated to the United States, anything 2 or 3 or more generations ago, having a lot to say about new immigrant, rights. And that to me is a very interesting logic. It's a logic of assigning ownership on chronology. It's actually just a logic, right? And yet the entitlement based on that logic that people feel to have lots of opinions and do lots of things that are anti-immigrant. It's a very interesting thing, right? I mean, interesting is a euphemism. It's a deeply concerning thing and problematic. And so, because my answer to that is, unless you're Native American, your logic doesn't hold up. And yet you're using it to be anti-immigrant when your own family was also a family of immigrants, right? So to me, that's a really good example of how a logic, it's just a logic, but it sets a set of things in motion that have massive implications for people's lives, for the economy, for, our collective humanity. And so, logics aren't just this little sweet thing I'm talking about. Logics start wars, and they also start peace.
Yeah. I mean, deeply
Logics,
fundamental to the way we
yeah,
think about everything.
yeah, deeply fundamental. And so my approach to leadership, actually, and to systemic sense making is precisely about excavating invisible logics. Um,
Mm,
because unless we do, we're not necessarily like, unless you're really clear what the logics are of the operating system that are invisible to you, but informing your decisions, you're not making as, intentional or careful decisions as you could, right? Like if only people really said them, hold on for a second, what logics are operating here in this moment that are perhaps not going to help me meet this moment, right? And if you want, I can take a little step back and like set the stage on some of this about logics, if that would be helpful. Whatever makes sense to you.
Yeah, I mean, I would be really curious because I mean, I think this is so important, and I feel like
Mm.
growing up in a my family, my ancestors for a long time, and their culture and the way they've lived is so different than the world that I grew up here. And so I feel like identifying the core beliefs of why someone thinks the way they do is something I started doing when I was like 3 or 4 years old. I was like, all right, this is why in my experience being American, this is why people fundamentally feel these ways. And then this is why fundamentally people feel different ways. Not necessarily one is better or different, but the
Right.
fundamental
They're
logics are
right.
different,
Mm-hmm.
which
Mm-hmm.
then create entire different ways of relating to each other. And that's why even when we talked about
Exactly.
authenticity, that immediately came to my mind because from the cultures I grew up, authenticity is not as valued. It's not an actual
That's
end
right.
goal because there
Yeah.
are other things that are more important than
That's
being your
right.
true self.
That's in my family too, right? There's things that are just more important than authenticity.
Yeah.
I think that's a very interesting, I think part of that is generational. I think part of it is about the consciousness raising that's happened intergenerationally over the past few generations. And
Yeah.
it's
I
also
mean,
about
and so,
culture and other things,
yeah,
but I mean, I
exactly.
think, yeah.
Yeah. And so I guess what I'm curious about is in bringing up the fundamental kind of understanding. The thing that I'm curious about is I think this is also a place where, in theory, a lot of manipulation can also arise. Where, for example, let's say I'm a teacher and I act like I am the enlightened one, and I'm like, I understand all the deep uh, logics that you have constructed your entire life around. Let me now come and enlighten you, my young one, with
Right.
everything that I know.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
it has to be, then that can feel so like they can just expose you to the things they want to expose you to so that you have a particular understanding of the world around you that they kind of have opened you to. But there are also other ways. I mean, I think one way that this is really interesting is like, let's say you studied like feminist history. The way you would relate to everything is through that particular lens versus
Right.
if you
Yeah, yeah.
studied
Hmm.
so because you're open to those particular
Right. Yeah.
lens of logic to like break down something. But to do it generally without the teacher instructor kind of like pushing you to look at the world in one particular direction, how would you go about
Hmm.
that?
How how would I go about say that last part again? How would I go about
Like exposing. Because okay, just to expand, the places that I've seen the type of work that you're talking about happen is usually in classes where they have a very particular agenda that they want to
oh, I
open your
see what you're
eyes
saying.
to.
Okay, yeah, yeah, got
They're
you.
not really trying to teach you the skills to really analyze and come up with your own conclusion. They're like, I have a particular
Yeah,
interpretation of history and
yeah.
how we've gotten to where we are. I want you to understand that as well.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So that in and of itself is a logic, right? And one of the things I tell my students, and I only teach graduate students, I feel very lucky. One of the things I tell my students is to, really think about what is this enterprise we call education, and what does it mean? Like, what does it mean um, for you to be taught qualitative research by me when I have a particular take on it and an agenda, not an agenda, but like I have a set of, um, what would I call it? A set of values, a set of,
Yeah.
you know, beliefs about, for example, the possibility of qualitative research when it's done in constructively critical and humanizing ways to really potentiate liberation, right? Like I believe in that. That's a bias. That's a Sharon Ravitch thing. So yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I'm hearing in what you're saying is, there's inculcation that can happen in education. And if we're not careful about the logics of the inculcation, you know, it, a lot can happen. I was talking with graduate students in our course yesterday about the artifact of a logic that we call um uh I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought. The logic of
Sure.
the artifact that we call oh my God, I can't remember. All right. I hope you're editing this.
No, no,
Um
it's okay.
I
Take your
literally
time.
forgot what I was saying.
Yeah, it's okay. You're, it seems like, is there one particular form of logic that you were trying to refer to? Maybe through like historical analysis.
What did I start saying? I literally can't remember.
I was writing down,
Um,
I don't know. You were talking about what is the enterprise of education? Um, like what are we really doing? And then to use that to open
I
up.
was saying I said something to my students yesterday, and I just can't
Yeah,
remember what it was. I'm sorry.
and it's okay.
Um,
I It's fine. I mean,
yeah.
I feel like, I think the reason all of this is super interesting is because one of the coolest parts of this work is I get to talk to so many, like when I talk to a lot of technology experts from the Bay Area, for example, you can very much clearly see their fundamental principles that help shape the way they view the world around progress, around what they think are the real issues, why are we not reaching those? And then when you talk to policy experts from DC, the way they think about issues are completely different. And then when you talk to academics and every single person has a set of these kind of fundamental underpinnings upon which they build everything else. One thing I'm really curious is, and I think one of the powers of philosophy, but also the terrifying thing about philosophy is that it exposes those things, but it doesn't really
Hmm.
teach you what to do once it's exposed, which I
Yeah.
think is more of like a behavioral practice. Because,
Hmm.
for example, I took an existentialism class during COVID, right before I graduated from undergrad, and one of the main questions, I mean, they were just asking, what is the purpose of your existence? Like, what does it really mean to exist? Is there something called purpose? What is it? And
It's
and
interesting.
it was a really intense period of time to kind of have that class be taking place. And while it was all very intellectual and it was really interesting, I mean, it changed my life. There were also a lot of students in that class who didn't know what to do now that they could start thinking about this. And I think that's also a real, so when we introduce this kind of awareness to these fundamental principles, how do you also prepare someone to now deal with the freedom that they now have, which is terrifying in some ways as well?
You're saying the freedom of like criticality, the freedom of thinking for themselves or thinking outside of the
Yeah.
constraints of, yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting thing. There are some people where their survival impulse is based on being free. And then, there are other people who, you know, don't, it really makes them fearful and uncomfortable. And then everyone in between. And I think, the thing about, like in my case, teaching, and again, I have graduate students. So these are master's and doctoral students, they're adults. And what's amazing is so the paradigm of graduate school is much more about independent thinking and criticality, and yet still I think for example in some of my classes where I'm less structured about certain things, it can actually make students really anxious. And so and some but I think that even these terms, freedom or criticality, mean very different things to different people. And to many of us, they sound amazing and absolutely bedrock of what's required. And to other people, they sound scary. Um, and so to me, part of, let's say teaching or leading or doing anything is about understanding how the human condition comes into anything we're doing. So right now, for example, I'm working with a colleague, Dr. Seiji Isatani, around a fear index for integrating AI into work life. And what's so fascinating about that is it's really where human development meets up with strategy. And to me, the human development piece of that is about care and compassion and understanding the range of reasons why people feel fear and why fear is on a continuum of feeling actually life threatening to some people. while to others, it's just, whatever it is, it's Tuesday. Um, to me, I think creating the conditions where people get to practice freedom of thought, freedom of writing outside of constrained genres. So even students in my classes, graduate students, and they've never written in the first person before because their educational socialization told them that it was, more academic and more rigorous to absent themselves. And I used to do that, 30 years ago. And so then they're suddenly given the freedom to locate themselves in their research. And it's uncomfortable and even perhaps scary. And why is that? Right? It's because they've internalized a set of logics that have told them to sterilize themselves out of their research because otherwise it's not objective, and so to me, there's all these, this is epistemological, it's a question of the nature of knowing and of what constitutes valid knowledge or what constitutes knowledge at all. And part of that is about really understanding that everyone gets to construct their own meaning. I can say 100 things in class. I have no idea what my students are actually walking away with.
Hmm.
They're all probably orbiting around what I meant and useful, I hope, to the students. But the reality is that, um, you know, I truly believe that all human communication is a kind of approximation of what we're able to understand of each other in the moment, given what we know at the time.
Hmm.
Right. So, to me, there's a lot in that around, what does it mean to create the conditions where everyone can think about how to be a student in that space, a learner in that space, a knower in that space, et cetera.
Yeah. I mean, I want to talk a little bit about adaptive leadership too, because this
Hmm.
this is also just something I'm personally really curious about. Because you create models of, I think having systems are really helpful in creating structure, which then allows you to then scale and do more things. And so you don't have to be too locked in on a day-to-day basis. But as each person learns and grows, they want to start changing the systems and structures around them so that it adapts to what they've learned. This process of change is actually in itself really complicated, and it's not really clear how to change without, because some change can actually make people start disbelieving in the system as a whole because they were like, you just changed it randomly. Why did we do it like that this whole time? And now all of a sudden it's just different. And there's also a lot of other responses, right? And so when we talk about adaptive leadership, what are the ways in which change can actually be implemented in a way where people don't just start doubting the whole thing?
Well, it's interesting. You had sent me a question that I think maybe I'll answer a question that you sent me, which is, what distinguishes adaptive leadership from more traditional modes of strategy or planning? And if it's okay with you, I think I can use that to really answer this question, and actually tie together a few different things.
Yeah.
So first, I'll just set the stage really quickly for sort of the set of things I'm thinking about to respond to you. And so the first thing I want to say is the workscape, like our lives and like society, is fractured, right? The workscape is very fractured right now. As I mentioned earlier, the era of precedent is over. It's been replaced by the era of rapid exponentializing change. And because leadership as we know it was built on a belief of predictability, right? There are well defined issues with clear solutions, ostensibly a blueprint that one could rely on for whatever, come what may. Now, that kind of thinking and organizational approach is firmly in the rearview mirror because precedent can no longer help given the new compounding, um, exponentializing change that's happening. And so, decision making, like basing our decision making, as I mentioned earlier, on precedent itself is a logic that's stale now. And so leaders now need to understand how to adapt and change proactively. I think of it as like a prosilience versus a resilience, to be able to cultivate their own logics and mindsets that help them be maximally adaptive. And And then they potentiate that in the system as a part of the systemic culture. Adaptivity becomes a part of the culture. And then that gets harnessed to help everyone level themselves up. And part of the reason for this kind of approach is that the pace of change is unpredictable. And the only thing we can predict now is that unpredictability. That's in terms of dissent and divisiveness, in terms of pandemics, AI, societal complexity, and global supply chain, all different sorts of things that really come into play together. And so, when we used to talk about leaders, we were talking about the people at the top of the house. But new ways of looking at this are that leaders in the workscape are now everyone, and that everyone needs to learn how to ask better questions, and really think together through what I call systemic sense making about how to respond to the very issues that they need to deal with today, tomorrow. And in that sense, inquiry is a connective tissue at the individual levels, inquiry into self, logics, et cetera. And at the cultural level, what are the sedimented logics in this ecosystem? How do we start to create a process where we can excavate, identify those, and replace them with newer logics that make sense? Being very a disciplined curiosity as I think about it. And a quote I love is, curiosity didn't kill the cat, it turned the cat into a lion. And I think we all need to be lions now. These are bold realities that we're living in. And so how adaptive leadership then differs from the more traditional, I'll get to now that I sort of laid that, which is adaptive leadership is very, very different. It's a completely different approach to leadership than traditional leadership or strategic planning or change management approaches. And the reason is it was created by Heifetz and Linsky at Harvard Business School in 2009, when business leaders were called on by the government when there was a very significant recession to try to massage the system back into higher functioning, the economy, and the business sector. And so adaptive leadership came in that moment to say that change is the constant. Homeostasis is not the constant. Change is the ongoing constant. And change needs to be reframed as relational and learning driven, an inquiry process that is not fixed like traditional methods, but that is, or not a top down blueprint, but that centers on what we call adaptive challenges. Complex, value-laden problems that have no clear technical fix. They require experimentation, dialogue, collaboration, and what I call distributed sense-making across stakeholders, as I mentioned earlier, the people closest to the phenomenon, rather than just going along hierarchical lines. And that's a core philosophical difference between, more traditional workplace functioning and strategic planning. And so I'm so sorry, that's my doorbell.
No, I can hear it.
Can you can't? Oh, good. Okay. So that's a core philosophical difference between strategic planning that assumes a relatively stable environment and relies on clear goals, linear timelines, and expert driven analysis to produce long-term plans, to produce change plans, to produce, whatever gets implemented. And so in the traditional model, leaders are the planners, directors set the strategy, they delegate the execution. And so participation is really limited to consultation or feedback on a pre-designed plan. But in adaptive leadership, it's a totally different paradigm and approach. Leaders are facilitators of inquiry. They're lead inquirers who actually create the conditions for a range of voices to surface, for tensions, for co-constructed and different and even divergent meanings. And that is a strategy that can only emerge through cycles of action and reflection and thought partnership and adjustment. It cannot be handed down. And so that has a piece about it that's about temporality and process. That traditional planning really works on a kind of episodic, a 1 year, a 3 year, a 5 year. And that's very bounded by very fixed milestones and metrics. Adaptive change, for example, treats planning as continuous, iterative, and relational, right? That goals and strategies are treated as a hypothesis that needs to be tested, that needs to be revisited, and then refined in dialogue. And so I'll wrap this answer up. You know, whereas traditional models tend to emphasize and centralize authority, try to minimize complexity and ambiguity so that they can prioritize predictability and control, that discourages deviation from the plan. Whereas adaptive leadership
Mm.
redistributes authority and embraces uncertainty. It leverages uncertainty, and it talks about valuing uncertainty over and valuing learning in uncertainty over comfort, over other things. And so it really invites risk and dissent in a constructive way, and because experimentation is necessary for us to get the contextual learning that we need for sustainable positive change. And so a final word on this is that we used to talk about in crisis leadership, we used to talk about VUCA context, VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And we would use that to talk about complex adaptive systems. The massive shift is that every workplace is a VUCA environment. Every workplace is now complex, uncertain, volatile,
Volatile.
uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And so, moreover, and I'll end here, these VUCA contexts are happening in a Bani world, BANI, brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. And so leaders need adaptive skills and strategies to help themselves and other people navigate this complex world. They literally need to be the portal or the night lantern that is helping people learn into the skills and the mindsets and the logics that they need as individuals, as teams, and then as workplaces, to push out of older ways of being that will not serve them, as
Mm.
well.
Yeah. I mean, what I'm hearing you say is that there feels like there needs to be this like deeply, this huge transformational shift in even how we think about businesses and how we think about organizations as a whole.
Absolutely. Yeah, the game has changed. And I think everything kind
Mm.
of looks similar, but it's really different inside. It's like when an individual makes a seismic shift inside and they're surprised everyone can't see it, on the outside. I think that we need to start thinking about more than, siloed fixes of things. We need to think more systemically about naming these phenomena and really thinking about strategies for humanization and for productive adaptivity. Innovation is only good when the innovation is good. And so really
Mm.
even thinking about what does innovation mean, there we have to really think about innovation for whom and what ways. And so to me, again, this notion of thinking about every environment as a complex adaptive environment means that that
Mm.
environment necessarily should see the bulk of its challenges as adaptive challenges that require a more robust inquiry process.
And I think a big part of
Technical
this is
challenges can
not,
get fixed easily. Yeah,
yeah, I mean, and a big piece of this is not being afraid by the kind of complexity of the issues that lay ahead, right?
I think that's the biggest part. I think that's the biggest part, is to try to not be afraid of these multi-headed hydra issues that are, these wicked problems, some are calling them. My colleague Philip Ellis talks about wicked problems that, you know, they're coming down the pike all the time. They're sort of becoming the norm. And so, yeah, I think that really this notion of proactive response, of prosilience, really understanding that if we can create norms that anticipate constant change, we can actually create a workscape that matches the realities people are struggling with and living with already.
Mm.
We're not going to change the realities. We're going to help people see them more clearly and build the skills and mindsets or capacities that they need. But again, I say building capacity in an assets based way, like these scarcity or deficit logics, that everyone needs to level up because there's just a new game on the table. we shouldn't look at anyone with a deficit. And you do start to hear people deficitizing other people for not being able to quote unquote catch up. But I think that the pace of change is so rapid that, we as leaders need to be asking, what are the real time conditions we need to create to help
Mm.
people level themselves up in ways that are potentiating and not punishing.
I wrote so many notes for this conversation. I mean, true. I mean, there's,
I'm
I
happy to
feel like,
talk again too.
no, no, yeah, I would love to. I mean, I feel like a lot of this is really foundational to like another aspect of think because I've never even thought about it. I mean, I haven't talked to a lot of like business experts on this show, and I feel like I'm now recognizing the value also of just talking to business leaders in all capacities to understand how do they think about change, how do they think about growth, how do they think about values and adaptive leadership and just leadership in general, because those principles actually play a huge role in schools as well because
Well, that's what I was going to say. Context is everything. It's the same thing in schools. And then if you're talking about K through 12 schools, it's the same thing in higher education, right? Like, I mean,
hmm.
they're different contextual things, but we need this in each all of the places. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Like,
100%.
the greatest treasure of my life, other than my family, is that I teach leaders and work with leaders and coach leaders from every sector. And to
Mm,
me, honestly, they have so much more in common with each other. Again, the solutions have to be tailored to context and mediating variables, but that a lot of the through line issues are similar is very, very interesting. I agree with you. To me, it can be a corporate leader, an education leader, a civil sector leader, a higher education leader, every leader. What I'm talking about can be of tremendous use to them, their teams, and their organizations. And again,
mm,
I've worked with 10 people organizations, and I've worked with the World Health Organization, which is 16,000 people. We've done work like this across lots of different countries at different scales. And so to me, it's really about how can we think about the ways that leaders can tap into the existing expertise and use that to bridge into more sort of future oriented strategy that is adaptive, or you could say
mm.
adaptive strategy that is future oriented. I mean, all adaptive strategy is future oriented, but um, it's also present oriented. And so, some
Yeah,
of that is the ability to look at the present and make, sense and make use of it in a set of ways.
yeah. I mean, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I feel like there is a lot more to cover, and I would love to have you on actually, and just to cover some more of these things.
Oh, I'd love to keep talking to you. The
Uh,
more I listen to your show, the more I was like, I want to be friends with him.
oh,
Um, no, I'm happy to keep. I mean, we can, if you want to ask me anything else in this conversation, please do, but we can also totally schedule to see each other again. I can't even explain it, but when you reached out to me and I looked you up, I just knew we were going to connect. Or maybe I hoped, I should say, I hoped we were going to connect. Felt it though. I really did. I was like, he and I will be
oh,
kindred. I just felt it. And I feel it even now. Like I'm being very myself. And a lot of times I'm a little bit, I mean, I'm always really myself, but like, I really feel comfortable with you. So thank you.
oh no, and yes, I have a lot more to. We have a lot more to get into. So I 100% a week or two when you're free, definitely. So we can cut it
Oh,
up just
definitely. Yeah.
for people listening. But I want to say thank you all for listening. I hope you really enjoyed today's conversation. I feel like this is such an important piece that we've added to this season. If you'd like to see more of the show, you can find us on Spotify, on Apple, and on YouTube. And if you've been enjoying everything and you would like to support, you can also find us on Patreon. But I hope you're having a great week, and as per usual, stay re-educated.